Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 became icons and legends in the 60s and 70s. With their swept wings and blazing jet engines, they ferried passengers around the globe at incredible speeds for the time. However, there was a third competitor that fought for a place on the podium next to these two champions. Supersonic jet manufacturer Convair built a pair of stunning aircraft as beautiful as they were fast. Would their good looks and speed be enough to topple 707s and DC-8s from their lofty mantle in the skies? Despite the option of an extended-range 880, they were not really intended to compete directly with 707s and DC-8s. Rather, they were medium-range and now lighter, smaller, and expectedly faster than the larger alternative. In service, 880s did prove to be the fastest, although at 615 miles an hour, only by a small margin. Eccentric millionaire Howard Hughes played an important role in the 880's development. For years, he had held secret meetings with the plane maker about a new commercial jetliner. After going through many iterations, this aircraft morphed into the 880.
Howard Hughes owned TWA, and TWA was a launch customer for the 880. And of course, Howard Hughes, if he hadn't made that leap, I doubt the 880 would have been built, because my recollection is that the launch orders were slim.
Other major airlines started to follow TWA's lead, although not in really large numbers. There seemed to be a market for the medium-size aircraft, even though the larger international range alternatives had been available 18 months earlier, and they offered much greater carrying capacity. But this would soon change. Although many agreed that Convair's offering was the most aesthetically pleasing of the new generation airliners and definitely faster, survival in the passenger airline business has always been a matter of economics. Still, the rationale of Convair's short-range formula was actually confirmed within 12 months of the 880's first flight, albeit in a rather bitter way. Although the 880 wasn't primarily intended to compete directly with Boeing's and Douglas's larger jets, this didn't prevent these two powerful commercial plane manufacturers from taking a bite out of Convair's short-range market. Through the years, Boeing would increase the length of its 707, but just as the 880 was getting started, Boeing produced its 720. The 720 was in fact a shortened version of the 707. A sizable length of the forward body was removed, and there were other modifications to follow suit, but in essence, it was a smaller, lighter, and shorter-range 707. What's more, because most of the R&D came from the larger model, and much of the testing was done on the original Dash 80, there was no need for a new prototype. All of this made 720s a cheaper aircraft than the 880.
Boeing introduced the 720, I think, primarily, in retrospect, as a Convair killer. It was a short-body version of the 707 with a different wing and less fuel, and again, basically became a regional aircraft. The airlines liked it because it had the same cockpit as the 707, and their crews could be interchanged, which is, of course, a fashion that's very much in vogue today, where Airbus and Boeing build airplanes that are common up and down their line.
150 720s were sold, more than twice the number of 880s. Although the success of the 720 did prove that Convair's medium market theory was sound, Boeing became the major benefactor, even though they were new to the airline industry. Desperate to sell 880s, Convair turned to its engineers to see if they could make it more appealing to buyers. The result was the 880M.
The 880, the 22, the straight 22, was a slick wing. It had no leading edge devices at all, and it had speeds compatible to probably the 727. Then the 880M, which they put an extra fuel tank in the center, which gave them just about 10,000 pounds of extra fuel, plus it had leading edge slats.
The addition of leading edge devices made the 880M safe to land at lower speeds, But even with this, its extended range and other changes, Convair still had a tough time competing with the 720s and 707s. Although the 880 fell out of favor with the airlines, it was the aircraft of choice for the king of rock and roll. Ron Strauss, Elvis Presley's pilot, recalls how the king came to purchase his own 880, the Lisa Marie.
Originally, Elvis bought a 707, but his attorneys advised him that if he bought that and some of the countries that he could go to in that, they would put a lien on it, and that would be the end of that airplane. So the broker was showing him different airplanes, and he looked at an 880, and he says, "I like that." And the broker says, "You really don't want an 880." And he says, "Well, I do." And he said, "Well, why do you want the 880? He said, "I like the way the engines look on it." And that's the reason he bought it, supposedly. He actually bought that airplane from Boeing, because Delta traded it in for new Boeing 727s. And so he bought it from Boeing for $225,000, which was pretty cheap, really. But then he put about $500,000 into the airplane, interior and the cockpit, etc.
Though the 880 was a financial disappointment, Convair wasn't finished yet. The company had two speedy planes in the works. Both would leave the 707s and DC-8s of the day in the dust, and one might have given the Concorde a run for its money. In the 1960s, there was a growing fear that the existing stable of American-made long-range airliners would become obsolete with the arrival of the supersonic Concorde. Convair proposed a quick and dirty solution for getting into the supersonic market. They already had plans for an enlarged Hustler, the B-58C. What if they used its basic shape and filled it with passengers rather than bombs? The new Model 58-9 would have been able to travel at Mach 2.4 and carry up to 52 passengers 2,900 miles, about the distance from New York State to California. As a baby step toward this aircraft, Convair would hollow out the weapons pod of the Hustler and convert it into a comfy passenger pod. It would have had windows, pressurization, AC, and seating for 5, changes the original pod designers would never have dreamed of. It would have been a clever and inexpensive way to learn about high-speed passenger travel without building a full aircraft. Convair's other fast plane was far more conventional and built upon the foundation of the 880. At the time, American Airlines had identified the need for a true coast-to-coast non-stop service across the U.S. The 60s were quickly approaching, the era of beach movies, the Beach Boys, and bikinis. Traveling from the snowy Northeast to a sunny California paradise was a dream airlines could easily sell to their passengers. To meet American Airlines specifications, Convair's redesign would have to be even faster than the original 880, a challenging task as it was also required to carry additional passengers. The new aircraft would now be known as the 990 or the Coronado.
Convair recognized that the 880 had missed the mark in terms of positioning, market positioning as we call it today, and they needed a bigger aircraft and longer range. American Airlines certainly, as the launch customer, was looking for that, and they ordered the first batch of 990s early on, and it was intended to be a transatlantic airplane with, and also of course very fast. Both of them are very fast aircraft. The 990 I believe was the fastest airliner at the time.
The extra seats requested by American would be achieved by simply extending the forward fuselage by 10 feet. However, the real challenge came with increasing the 990's top speed. This might be a tall order for Convair, even with its extensive military experience. Firstly, Convair would tackle the power plants. 880s used a slightly defanged version of the Hustler's J-79 turbojet made by General Electric. Given that the B-58 had the capability to reach twice the speed of sound, it's reasonable to assume there would be plenty of surplus power for the very fast subsonic airliner. However, the Hustler's engines also used afterburners, something the first-generation jet airliners could never do. By promising extra speed to American Airlines, Convair had to look to GE for extra thrust, and this came in a really clever development.
The 880 had the CJ805, which was just a straight early version jet. Then the 990 came out with the same engines that the B-58 had, but the B-58 had afterburners on them. The 990 had the CJ805 I think 23s, and they had the aft fan.
GE took the original 805 turbojet and added a fan turbine system at the back of the engine. The turbine was driven by the main jet's exhaust flow and turned a special fan that converted additional cold air into extra thrust. The net result was greater power for no extra fuel. The new fan jet was known as the 805-23. More thrust with greater economy sounded like the answer for Convair. By drawing on their military experience yet again, they had still one more card to play. In 1953, Convair began testing its prototype F-102 Dagger supersonic fighter. The results were poor, and the aircraft proved to be a long way short of supersonic. The 102 was encountering a phenomenon known as transonic drag on the fuselage. The problem was solved when an aerodynamic formula known as the area rule was employed. The fuselage was indented at the point where the wings joined with it, giving a Coke bottle look to the aircraft, a change which got the Dagger through the sound barrier. Unfortunately, transonic drag could start to occur around the top speed at which the 990 was expected to fly. Of course, the fuselage of an airliner could not be bent into a Coke bottle shape like a fighter jet. However, there were other options. Enter the anti-shock body. This was designed to deal with the transonic drag problem from the wing. Aerodynamic pods mounted on the trailer edge of each wing would smooth out the airflow and reduce drag. Sometimes known as Kuchayman's carrot, after one of its German inventors, the concept was first seen in early Soviet jet bombers.
What happened is, without the anti-shock bodies, the 990 was so fast that when you approached the critical Mach number, you'd get a vibration in the fuselage. So what they did is the engineers designed these anti-shock bodies, and that prevented that operation. And then somebody got smart and said, well, why don't we put fuel in those things? And we did. We put about 10,000 pounds total. So that gave us just about, on cruise, it gave us an extra hour of cruise. And they worked pretty fine.
In the quest for speed, Convair engineers swept back the wings of the 990 even more than the 880, a change that forced pilots to remain alert to avert a disaster.
The 990 had 39-degree sweep, where the 707, 880, and the DC-8 had approximately 35-degree sweep. So it had a tendency to Dutch row. And on a Dutch row, if you put incorrect recovery procedure or not soon enough, it would progressively get worse where it could go inverted. So the 990 was, you had to pay attention on the Dutch row.
More powerful engines, greater wing sweep, and speed pods on the wings all should have offset the extra weight of a longer cabin. However, the speed boost was not impressive. It was almost a rerun of the earlier XF-102 disappointment, only this time the area rule had already been applied. There was no third chance for Convair in a U.S. airliner business already carved up amongst other players. Soon 707s and 720s would be available with turbofan engines, blunting the 990's competitive speed edge. When the 990 failed to reach its promised target to American Airlines, the company reduced its original order.
It didn't stay in service with American for very long. They replaced it with the 707. Its economics just didn't compare at all. I think the Convair was highly regarded for its structural strength and fatigue resistance, but the fuel consumption was just not competitive against the more modern 707 and DC-8.
All told, a total of 37 Coronados were sold mainly to American, Swissair, and Scandinavian SAS. Add to that the 65 880s nets 102 airframes in total. With so few sales to amortize the development and tooling costs, Convair was facing colossal losses. At that time, it was the largest financial write-down in U.S. history. So what went wrong for Convair?
It was fundamentally incorrectly sized for the market, and therefore the only way to correct that would have been to start again with a clean sheet, which would have been an expensive project and presumably beyond their financial resources at the time. It certainly ended Convair's excursion into civilian aircraft production.
The success of the 707 was undoubtedly influenced by Boeing's past relationship with the Air Force and really knowing its needs. Also, a big factor was President Bill Allen's preparedness to gamble on the back end of the jet tanker deal to get his company into the airline business. On the other hand, when Boeing, through necessity, skipped right past the straight-wing turboprop option, they left other companies with little choice but to follow. Douglas were already about as close to the long-range passenger market as any company could have been, and, where possible, used this fact to make up the difference of their being later to the market than Boeing. However, both companies were quick to make major and expensive adjustments to their designs, so they could stay abreast of the 6 seats across requirements. There was actually a fourth player in the long-range jet airliner race, which also had ample seating: the sturdy Vickers VC-10, a descendant of the VC-7. But the Brit jetliner couldn't compete with the aviation giants Boeing and Douglas, who quickly saturated the market with their own offerings. Convair's extra speed edge was declined in favor of guaranteed extra passenger dollars offered by Boeing and Douglas.
The fuel that they got per seat mile was much larger on the Convair 990 and 880 compared to the 70 and the DC-8. And airlines were talking profit, and that's where the profit was strictly in seat per mile.
Another blow to Convair's slightly narrower concept came when Boeing introduced their shorter size and range 720 version of the basic 707. This fitted very closely to where Convair had looked for market safety. Conversely, although at first Douglas resisted stretching their new jet passenger plane, it eventually had little choice in doing so to satisfy a fast-developing jetliner market. In the company's time-honored way, it extended the DC-8's fuselage on several occasions in the same fashion that had worked so well with their famous series of 4-engine propeller-driven airliners. There is more carnage that can be traced back to when Boeing first opted for a swept-back wing. Whilst some post-war turboprops were successful, others were not. The straight-wing British Vanguard and their Britannia never reached anything like the sales predicted. And in the U.S., Lockheed's Electra suffered an economic fate nearly as bad as the 990. Clearly, the market was looking for the extra speed of pure jet power. Convair's even faster airliner, the proposed Supersonic Transport Model 58-9, had an even more grim fate. The design didn't meet the performance benchmarks the U.S. government was looking for. The aircraft would have been able to reach Mach 2.4 only. Mach 3 was considered the optimal speed for supersonic passenger transport. Also, it would not have been a comfortable ride. Essentially, the 52 passengers would have been crammed into an enlarged B-58 bomber's slender fuselage. Even if Convair had been chosen by Congress to develop the aircraft, all SST development came to a grinding halt in the U.S. Beyond the problems of sonic booms disturbing the public and shattering windows, the aircraft were not economical for airlines to operate. The disappointments of the 58-9, 880, and 990 put Convair out of the civilian market permanently. Still, with its long, slim fuselage and trailing wing pods, the 990 was a vision, although good looks don't always make a successful aircraft. In the end, it was the 707, followed closely by the DC-8, that would become the iconic jetliner of the 60s. It captured the imagination of the public as it ferried leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people to the key moments of that turbulent and magical decade. Although the 990 had been resoundingly defeated by the 707s and DC-8s in the battle for jetliner supremacy, in 1970 and 1971, the 990 accomplished a first for passenger aircraft. Modern air transport created a unique round-the-world ticket to take high-rolling passengers to every continent of the world. However, it was the boldest of routes over the poles. It was not an inexpensive ticket, $10,000, but it was well worth it to the flight's 70 all-male adventurers, a mix of millionaires, playboys, and retirees. Modern Air Transport's 990s served as aircraft for this month-long journey in honor of polar explorer Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. It was a small victory for an aircraft with an underwhelming career, and yet with so much potential. In 1975, the last of Swissair's Coronados, nicknamed St. Gallen, was officially retired. She took her last voyage not by air, but by water, across Lake Lucerne on a specially built barge. Swissair's 990s had crisscrossed across Europe, the Middle and Far East and South America for 13 years. Fittingly, after so many years of service, St. Gallen was given a place of honor after her retirement. The jetliner now resides at the Swiss Museum of Transport, where she still catches the eye of visitors with her elegant lines. With the aircraft frozen in mid-air, they can only imagine her incredible speed in a bygone era.
The Convair XFY-1 Pogo was the world's first truly operational tailsitter. It was also the fastest propeller-driven airplane in history. It was designed as a new breed of Navy fighter, a self-defense interceptor that could sit on the back of a ship and rise vertically to attack any threat. It had only one rival, the Lockheed XFV-1. Like the Pogo, the XFV-1 was built to meet the Navy's requirement for a tail-sitter combat fighter. It successfully flew in both the horizontal and vertical positions, but unlike the Pogo, it never attempted a vertical takeoff or landing. Both test programs were conducted throughout the early 1950s. By 1956, they'd been canceled. And yet the Pogo proved it could be done. It was the first tail-sitter to take off vertically, transition to conventional flight, and return to a vertical landing. This is the story of the brief but colorful career of the XFY-1 Pogo. To some, it is a success story. To others, just another misguided experiment. It's said that the Navy could never have used such an item. But if so, why did the program get as far as it did? And why is the concept being revisited? Naval aviation did not truly mature until after World War I. Under the leadership of Rear Admiral William Moffett, the Bureau of Aeronautics was established to guide the development of naval air power. The lessons learned in the First World War had shown that the fleet was best protected when in the presence of airborne guardians. Large flying boats with their heavy bomb loads proved a formidable defense against submarine attacks. The patrol flying boat would form the backbone of naval aviation, and as their range increased, they could extend the defense perimeter far off America's coastline. Flying boats clearly shared an affinity with the sea. But naval aviation was evolving. The Navy was looking for ways to tie aircraft closer to its ships. Small observation float planes were installed on vessels and launched by catapult. But a new kind of vessel would soon arrive, a new champion of naval warfare that would render these catapult planes obsolete.
The single float plane that the Navy had, things like the Kingfisher and its predecessors, the SC that came along behind it, were all designed to be spotting airplanes for the big guns on the fleet, the cruisers and the battleships, to determine where the shot was falling and correcting any errors due to windage or whatever. They could say up so many yards or down so many yards or so many mils right or left, and they could correct it and get the shot spotted in on the target. Well, with the demise of the gun as a primary naval weapon, as Navy to Navy, and the aircraft carrier being the primary combat vessel, there was no further need for the observation airplanes. Further, they could use the helicopter to do exactly the same job that the seaplane did, and with none of the difficulties that operating a seaplane provided. So the need for a seaplane or a float plane just stopped. It wasn't there anymore.
The aircraft carrier was literally a floating airfield, a mobile air base with which the U.S. Navy could extend its reach further than ever imagined. Naval aviation was maturing rapidly, and as World War II approached, it appeared that controlling the seas would depend largely on controlling the skies above. The age of the carrier aircraft had arrived. After decisive victories like those of Midway and the Solomon Islands, it was clear the aircraft carrier had changed the face of modern naval warfare. With this new spearhead of naval power, the U.S. and its allies began chipping away at Japan's Pacific Empire. Launching air raids, they wreaked havoc on island bases. In desperation, Japan launched a last-ditch effort to thwart the advancing Allied forces, the kamikaze attack. Suicide planes filled with TNT were sent to hurl themselves into the decks of carriers. With a direct hit, the damage could be devastating. It was a sobering thought. If the carrier could be sunk, so could all its aircraft. Despite the Holocaust, most kamikaze aircraft missed their targets. A few, however, did not. Navy planners began to question the wisdom of concentrating their air power on a single ship. Some called for dispersion. Others mentioned the term VTOL, or vertical takeoff and land.
The U.S. Navy had some awful lessons at the back end of World War II, tying their air power up in a relatively small number of flat-top ships called carriers, and they lost a few to the kamikaze aircraft. They wanted a self-defense fighter, basically, which could be based in almost any ship in a task force or fleet. And that was the move into VTOL. And the Navy, I think, the U.S. Navy, were the first ones to pursue this objective.
However, the Navy was not the first to consider the use of VTOL aircraft. The Germans, toward the end of World War II, designed a tailsetter called the Focke-Wulf Triebflügel. A ramjet was mounted at the tip of each of its three mid-body wings, which would spin and lift the aircraft like helicopter rotors. The Triebflügel was built as a fighter that required no runway, and it was intended to attack Allied bombers, which had already decimated Germany's airfields. Once airborne, the German tail-sitter would fly horizontally, although it was never determined exactly how the transition would be made. To land, the pilot who lay prone would have to look over his shoulder, through the rotors and exhaust to see the ground. It was an awkward position, to say the least. Still, the German design did recognize that only the most powerful of engines would be sufficient to lift an aircraft straight up into the air. The Triebflugel fighter would never be built. It would have come too late anyway. Germany had already been brought to its knees under the constant pounding of Allied bombers. High above Germany, Air Force pilots learned how fast airfields could be destroyed. The idea was catching on. Perhaps the future of modern warfare lay in aircraft that can operate free of fixed airstrips. This is San Diego, California, as it looked just after World War II, cherished for its clear skies, warm climate, and coastal location. It is home to one of the largest U.S. naval bases, and it has always been a hotspot of aviation. It was also home to the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation, or Convair, which would build the first operational VTOL aircraft intended for the U.S. Navy. Here, during World War II, thousands of Liberator bombers and squadrons of long-range Catalina and Coronado flying boats had been built to help win victory for the Allies. Now, as America settled into the Cold War, Convair was building new aircraft, including the massive B-36 bomber, and new concepts were being developed. Under Project Hummingbird, the U.S. Navy had sponsored design studies for a VTOL fighter that could be installed on the backs of ships to protect naval convoys. In 1951, the Navy awarded Convair a contract to build such an aircraft. Captain Sid Sherby of the Navy's Fighter Design Desk was project officer for the test program.
We had the same requirements for it that we had for our seagoing helicopters. It had to be able to take a certain amount of crosswind, certain amount of deck roll, and all that. And that pretty much determined what the footprint had to be for it when it was sitting this way. And the idea for this was that it would take off vertically and gradually rotate forward and then go into normal flight and fly as a normal airplane. To land, it would come back at reduced power, and you can go through this transition and go to hover, and then back and land. So all you needed was a fairly clear spot on someplace on the ship where there wasn't rigging or things like that would have a big enough footprint for this thing to come, and here you had your own interceptor.
The Navy contracted only one other company to develop a VTOL fighter, Lockheed. Both companies' designs would be built around the Allison T-40 turboprop engine, but Convair appeared to be one step ahead of the game. From the start, Convair elected to operate its experimental aircraft in the VTOL mode. For this reason, it received the first vertically running T-40 engine, which drove two contra-rotating propellers. The wing was a Delta. This design concept would prove essential to making successful transitions between vertical and horizontal flight. At Moffett Field, California, the old rigid airship Hangar No. 1 was selected for what was officially called vertical taxi trials. From its 195-foot-high ceiling, Convair engineers dangled an enormous tether cable that was to be attached to the aircraft's nose. Once secured to the safety rig, the aircraft could rise to at least 100 feet and literally fly inside the enormous hangar. On April 29, 1954, the aircraft made its first tethered flight. By now, it had a nickname, Pogo Stick, so dubbed for its ability to jump straight into the air. The Pogo's T-40 engine was actually two T-38 turboprops married into a single gearbox. It produced over 5,800 horsepower, and every bit was needed to pull the aircraft straight up by its nose. The cable rig installed above the propellers could either lift the Pogo up or slack off to let it back down. At the time, the team was unaware that the huge props were recirculating the air within the hangar. This caused terrific turbulence and often loss of control. Additional cables had been attached to the cruciform tips that went to powered drums. In the event of trouble, the pilot's cry was simple: "Catch me! Catch me!" And an engineer would then snap the cables taut to straighten the aircraft. The test pilot was J.F. Skeets Coleman. Coleman had been meticulous in his training for these tests. He had practiced in all types of helicopters to prepare for vertical flight. But nothing could prepare him for landing. In the vertical position, the Pogo seat lay on its back. While working the controls in front of him, Coleman had to look over his shoulder at the ground behind him. Similar to the German Triebflügel, landing the Pogo was a difficult maneuver. Hundreds of tethered flights would be conducted until the team was ready to take the Pogo outside for its first free vertical hover. Outdoors, the Pogo could fly without the ill effects of the hangar turbulence, but it would also be without the security of the safety tether rig. However, this did not bother Coleman. He was more concerned with the unnatural act of peering over his shoulder to land the aircraft, a problem that critics would later deem unacceptable. In November of 1953, Lockheed rolled out its VTOL experimental aircraft at Edwards Air Force Base for preliminary taxi trials. It was called the XF-V1. It was fitted with a special undercarriage beneath the fuselage for conventional takeoffs and landings. Although it used the same T-40 turboprop design, its engine had not been vertically tested, hence the need for conventional landing gear. The test pilot, Herman Salmon, was widely admired among test pilots, who knew him as simply Fish, and the XF-V1 would in turn be dubbed the Salmon, in tribute to its colorful pilot. Like the Pogo, the XF-V1 was designed as a tail-sitter, but its footprint was considerably smaller. The most obvious difference was in the wing design. Lockheed's aircraft sported stubby, straight wings, like those installed in the XF-104 Starfighter. The Pogo's larger delta wing was a Convair trademark. Its wingtips, in combination with the dorsal and ventral fins, made for a much wider and more stable footprint, especially for an aircraft that was going to be perched on the back of a rolling ship. The pilot's position was the same as that of the Pogo. To Herman Salmon, it seemed like a crazy way for a pilot to fly. Salmon and the Lockheed engineering team were unsure of the T-40 turboprop design. It was powerful, the most powerful propeller engine of its day, but they were convinced it was incapable of sustained operation in the vertical mode. They preferred to test the engine's performance and all the systems within the safety of conventional operation. As one engineer concluded, it was foolish to risk the pilot's life with an unreliable engine and an untested concept. Convair, on the other hand, was prepared to go all the way. On August 1st, 1954, outside the old airship hangar at Moffett Field, the Pogo engineering team prepared the aircraft for its first free vertical hover. The first of many defining moments for the aircraft and its pilot. The test had been scheduled for the early morning for lower temperature and no wind conditions. In the tethered flight tests, the Pogo's engine had demonstrated power loss with rising ambient temperatures. Skeets Coleman, however, was more than confident. He had had a lot of practice mastering the Pogo's vertical handling capabilities inside the hangar. 60 hours of tethered flights, he thought, should be more than enough. Still, there must have been tension in the air. Not just for Coleman, but for everyone tied to the project. Convair executives, Navy brass, and of course the press were all going to be there to see if Pogo could truly fly. Not since the German Triebflügel had an aircraft been designed with engine thrust that exceeded the weight of the aircraft. Indeed, the Pogo's T-40 was pure muscle. The powerful turboprop needed no warm-up. Each of the two contra-rotating propellers were 16 feet in diameter. The two units had been selected to counteract the torque that would normally be produced by a single prop engine. Such torque force would have made control in the vertical mode impossible. Every bit of power was soaked up by the huge propellers. As soon as the turbine could be brought up to speed, the aircraft was ready for takeoff. The absence of warm-up was obviously a tremendous advantage, especially since the Pogo was expected to respond quickly to an attack on its ship. With a push to the throttles, the growling T-40 flexed its muscle and pulled the Pogo up by its nose. It had made this jump hundreds of times before in the hangar, but for this demonstration, Coleman had to prove how well the Pogo could maneuver in a free hover. In hover, the Pogo responded neither like an airplane nor a helicopter. For control, the prop's slipstream was deflected off the wing's elevons and the fin's rudders. Moving left or right was affected by the rudder pedals. Fore and aft by the stick. Easy enough so far, but if Coleman wanted to move off, say, 45 degrees, he would have to combine rudder and stick forces simultaneously and truly think about every move. It was very easy to become completely confused. Nevertheless, Coleman flew the aircraft like a pro, no doubt because of his extensive training in the hangar. Landing was still the most challenging act of operation. Craning his neck, he peered at the ground below him and eased the throttle back for a gentle touchdown. A howling success. It seemed fitting that this new breed of Navy aircraft should succeed at Moffett Field, so named in honor of the admiral who had championed the development of naval aviation some 30 years earlier. There was kudos for all, especially Skeets Coleman.
The pilot on this historic first flight of a vertical takeoff airplane was J.F. Skeets Coleman, Convair Engineering Test Pilot and Marine Reserve Officer. How did it go, Skeets?
Went swell, Dick. It was just the way we expected it. Of course, we didn't try to do too much, but everything went along fine.
I noticed that the operation was pretty much just straight up and straight down. Do you think you could have done more today?
Well, we could have done a lot more. The airplane was responding dutifully and just like we expected, but today we wanted to do just that, up and down.
Is it as maneuverable as a helicopter close to the ground?
Well, of course, we haven't investigated too far yet, but I think it's going to be much more maneuverable.
What do you think the future of the aircraft is?
Unlimited.
Indeed, to some, it would lead the next generation of Navy fighters. Convair considered the Pogo's first free vertical flight a triumph. But the next step would be the true test of a tail sitter, a full transition into horizontal flight. The sole virtue of a tail sitter, or any vertical takeoff aircraft, is that it doesn't need a runway. It can take off from virtually anywhere. It was thus necessary to build a ground transporter for the Pogo. If it could take off anywhere, something had to be designed to take it there. Convair engineers produced this special vehicle that could cradle the Pogo without harming the ventral fin, then transport it, and with hydraulics, lift the aircraft into the vertical launch position. One of the most important innovations devised for flight operation was the adjustable pilot seat. It was designed to rotate about 20 degrees forward during the transition from horizontal to vertical flight. Without this rotation, the pilot would literally fall out of the airplane, regardless of how strong he was or how tight the shoulder straps might be. This only added to the complication of flight control. As Coleman would soon learn, making the transition for vertical landings would be more difficult than anticipated. The Pogo's delta wing was perfectly suited for pulling into the vertical landing position. It was an advanced design that was already being successfully used on other high-performance aircraft being developed by Convair. The XF-92A experimental test plane was Convair's first attempt to incorporate the delta wing. In this case, the goal was to achieve sustained supersonic flight. Studies had shown that a 60-degree delta was far superior to a swept-wing design from the standpoint of drag, stability, and control. In September 1948, the XF-92A took off from Edwards Air Force Base and broke through the sound barrier. The world's first powered Delta was a success, and Convair would build Delta wing fighters into the 1960s. But in the Pogo's case, the Delta wing was selected not for supersonic flight, but for its high resistance to stalling. The transition to vertical hover required a relatively slow airspeed. With a Delta, a stall would be next to impossible. Located 16 miles from San Diego, Brown Field had been selected as the site for the second stage of the Pogo's flight test program. Coleman performed over 70 vertical hover tests in preparation for the first transition to horizontal flight. On November 2nd, 1954, the Convair team was ready. It had been 7 years since the Navy had first contemplated the development of vertical takeoff aircraft. In that time, however, a voice had grown within the Navy that was now suggesting the tail-sitter concept should never have gone past the research stage. Despite the outspoken critics, it was of no concern to Coleman. On this day, his job was to make the Pogo fly, not worry about its future. Coleman believed that the initial transition to horizontal flight would not be difficult. The return to vertical flight, the hovering descent from altitude, and the final descent to an exact spot landing would be infinitely more difficult and dangerous. As usual, the liftoff was flawless. By now, taking off was second nature to Coleman. And the transition. This too was executed masterfully with a smooth application of power and a gentle pushover. There was no more than 50 feet under the ventral fin during the whole graceful maneuver. The muscle-packed engine that had been designed to pull the Pogo straight up would now show what it could do in level flight.
It had a thrust-to-takeoff weight ratio of better than 1, so bingo, you know, to get going, and it had tremendous performance, and it flew well in the air.
The Pogo could fly at nearly 600 miles per hour. It had no drag devices, no speed brakes. Even at flight idle, it was too fast for the AD-5 chase plane. Using all of its 2,500 horsepower engine, the chase plane just could not keep up. The Pogo was both the slowest and the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in history. Proposed armament for the Pogo comprised 4 20mm cannons and wingtip pods, or 48 folding fin rockets. The initial concept called for deploying these tail-sitters on the backs of various ships of the task force. Once a radar threat was known, they would be launched from their ships and guided into the attackers. Like a mobile aerial picket line, the Pogos would then engage the attackers until carrier aircraft could arrive. Indeed, that was the theory behind the VTOL fighter. But theories often look better on paper than they do in real life. Still, the Pogo was showing more promise than its rival. Lockheed's tail-sitter was not performing as well as Convair's Pogo. The XFV had been flying more than the Pogo, but no vertical takeoffs or landings were being attempted. Instead, horizontal and vertical transitions were all done at altitude. The short, stubby, straight wings proved problematic. When transitioning from horizontal to vertical flight, the XFV was unstable. Herman Salmon, the pilot, remarked that in a shallow transition at about 30 degrees, the aircraft would want to roll and become quite unmanageable. The aircraft would stall until finally, at about 80 degrees, when almost vertical, it would be easy to handle again. While it could make the transitions, it had a harder time making them.
The Convair and the Lockheed turboprop-powered VTO aircraft look different, but in fact they followed exactly the same principles. They had a very powerful turboprop in the nose with a slender fuselage, wings, in one case a cruciform wing, and they used the controls that were there for normal wing-borne flight in VTOL flight. They flapped the rudders and they flapped the elevators and they flapped the ailerons, all of which were in that very well understood propeller slipstream.
In the end, the Lockheed team decided to put an end to the project. The head flight test engineer himself wrote a letter to the Navy. In it, he simply requested that they terminate the program. After some 20 minutes of conventional flight time, Skeets Coleman was ready for the moment of truth. Flying as low as possible to the ground in idle power, he pulled into a sharp climb. Thanks to the delta wing, there was no stall. At the peak of the climb, Coleman applied power just enough to acquire vertical hover. Going straight up required 3 different configuration changes at the same time. The seat had to be rotated up, the trim adjusted, and power applied. For the descent, Coleman then had to ease the throttle back and redirect his attention from the instrument panel to the ground below. Looking down, back over his shoulder, he had to keep his eyes on the tarmac until touchdown. The entire process was unimaginable to most pilots, and yet Coleman had made it look as smooth and natural as if he'd made a conventional landing. When he repeated the same spectacular demonstration for the Navy and national press 2 days later, the crowd was thoroughly impressed. The world's first vertical takeoff and land aircraft was an exciting accomplishment. The question now was, would the Navy actually use it?
It takes off straight up. It flies level at over 500 miles per hour. The first man in history to fly the Navy's new XFY-1 fighter plane, designed by Convair, is Convair test pilot J.F. Skeets Coleman, a man who smokes for the pure pleasure of smoking.
The U.S. Navy, by 1954, was beginning to reevaluate the VTOL program. The skeptics insisted that what the Navy intended was unrealistic, and the tail-sitter concept terminally flawed. True, they conceded the Pogo was an impressive machine, and yes, it was successful in flight tests. But as a convoy fighter, real-life operation was a different matter.
All these tests took place in clear weather. Nice bright skies, sunshine, and the rest of it. Whereas what the Navy were really after was an aircraft that could operate from a ship in pitch and roll in rough seas and bad visibility. And they never hacked that one. It wasn't an inviting prospect, I should say, as well.
The arguments for a VTO combat aircraft varied. The most popular justification for its development was the convoy fighter, where one would be installed on a merchant vessel, poised upward, ready to defend its ship. But others argued that an attack could still slip through undetected. Submarines could still pose a serious threat to merchant shipping. For that matter, the Naval Task Force as a group was considered a vulnerable target. What with the advent of nuclear weapons and supersonic aircraft, the call was for dispersion and mobility. Air power was part of the answer, but airfields can be destroyed again and again. Convair offered a solution, a flying task force that was completely divorced from the airstrip. A water runway is virtually impossible to knock out of action. Convair had built the R-3Y Tradewind as a cargo carrier for the U.S. Navy, but the company proposed a more enhanced role for the huge flying boat, logistic transport. It would form the backbone of an integrated weapons system designed to hold and support advanced base operations. The concept was called the Mobile Base System, and it was comprised of aircraft that could operate free of fixed installations. Here, Convair demonstrates how the enormous hull of the R-3Y could be filled with assault troops, vehicles, and machinery. Like an amphibious invasion, these flying boats would be sent to supplement the carrier strike force by securing an advanced base. Like the Pogo, the R-3Y used the powerful T-40 turboprop. After reaching its destination, the R-3Y could then taxi up to any beachhead and deliver its cargo. The idea was to establish a waterborne support and holding force. But this force would need its own strike capability. Convair had just the aircraft in mind. The XF-2Y Sea Dart. This was an advanced experimental plane that Convair introduced in 1952. Built as a supersonic fighter for the U.S. Navy, it sported the trademark delta wing design. but it was unlike any other fighter built by Convair. Extending 2 hydroskis beneath its streamlined fuselage, the Sea Dart was able to land on water. It was the world's first and only supersonic seaplane, and it seemed ideally suited for Convair's proposed mobile base concept. It was a forward strike aircraft that needed no fixed runway. Under this mobile base system, the beachhead could be dispersed over many miles of coastline, not concentrated on a heavily defended airstrip location. Costly amphibious landings would be unnecessary, and to protect the advancing troops, the third component of this integrated weapon system, the XFY Pogo. It was no seaplane, but it could operate without an airstrip. For tactical close-air ground support, the Pogo was a necessary ingredient to the operation of an effective mobile-based system. Clearly, Convair argued, the Pogo showed potential far beyond its convoy fighter role. In theory, it was an intriguing concept, but in actuality, the mobile-based system drew little support within the Navy.
Things that they talked about were largely possible, but whether they were the actual best ways to do things or not, I don't know. History hasn't, I don't think, either condemned it or validated it one way or the other.
The R-3Y would join the Navy in 1956 as part of the Naval Air Transport Service. Restricted to hauling cargo across the Pacific Ocean, it was never integrated into a mobile-based system. In fact, the flying boat in general was already fading from naval aviation. The Sea Dart remained as an experimental aircraft, but would never join the Navy. By 1957, the test program was canceled. It was undoubtedly a remarkable achievement, but the Navy, in the end, found no use for it. Needing special equipment and tenders, it required more care than it was worth. Needless to say, the mobile base concept never went beyond the proposal stage. Support for continued development of traditional naval aircraft was too strong to continue a costly test program like the Sea Dart. And the Pogo, its future was uncertain at best. It became increasingly more difficult to justify its role in naval operations. But even had a requirement existed, the Pogo still had some unacceptable control problems, despite Coleman's skillful demonstrations. When in the hands of anyone else, the results were nearly disastrous. The backup pilot, John Knable, attempted vertical flight without prior training on the tether rig.
Okay, John, give her a little power. Bigger.
Here, Skeets Coleman tries to guide him through the hover.
Oh boy, all right, let's come off the power. Let's come off the power. Take it easy. Down. Bring her down, John. Back at power. Back at power, John. Back at power. Keep her. That's it. You're right straight. Now bring her back at power a little bit. Bring her back at power. A little right aileron. A little right aileron. Bring her back at power, John. Bring her down. Bring her down. Right aileron. Okay, a little left aileron. Right aileron, John. That's it. You got her under good control. But keep her going. Keep her going up. Power, power, John. That's enough. That's enough. Put your nose up. Nose up. Okay, a little right under. Keep her straight. Now, easy on the controls, John. Easy on the controls. Bring her down. Bring her down, boy. Bring her down. Come on. A little off the power. Bring her down. Not too fast. Atta boy. Okay. Cut. Okay, John. You can hold her a minute. Shut down.
The most unnatural position to fly, and when they'd come to the vertical after doing a decelerating transition, they had effectively to feel for the ground, and no view downwards and behind them at all. That was one of the problems. I mean, the pilot couldn't see behind him and didn't know how far off the ground he was. Very difficult. It wasn't a natural piloting position by any means, and it's not a position that I think pilots would ever get used to. I mean, again, all this flying was done in clear blue skies and the rest of it, of course, and so they never really tested it under adverse meteorological conditions or with a big gusting wind.
In 1956, Convair set up a tether rig at Brown Field to resume pilot training. Skeets Coleman had made his longest and final flight on June 16, 1955. He had already received the prestigious Harmon Trophy for being the first man to successfully take off vertically, transition to horizontal flight, and return for vertical landing. Under his control, the Pogo was indeed a graceful machine. The inevitable happened on August 1st, 1956. The experimental test program of the XFY-1 Pogo stick was officially terminated. By then, despite its accomplishments, the Pogo had lost its support within the Navy.
It worked and worked fine. There wasn't any problem with it. The engines were good, but no requirement. The threat vanished. It didn't exist anymore.
Since the birth of seaplanes, naval aviation has adapted to the changing face of modern warfare. The Pogo was conceived for a specific need, but that need had faded before the aircraft could be perfected. Imagine landing the Pogo on this deck, trying to work its confusing hovering controls while straining your neck, looking backward to see the landing area. It was an unrealistic notion. Even the seagoing helicopter today operates at great risk, and its duty is quite limited. The U.S. Navy would never entertain the tail-sitter concept again.